Hi everyone, welcome. This is my tracking spreadsheet, and these orange colored rows that you see down here in the middle, these represent red wiggler bins, and the red wiggler bins really started seeing some problems a number of weeks ago. Back here, 22 days ago, you could see was the first occurrence where I went into that bin. It was what I thought to be my most heavily populated bin at the time. As you can see here, 2,200 worms represents the number of worms that the system had been originally launched with, but over time I'm sure that the population was breeding and increasing their numbers. But when I went into that system on the 18th of last month, I found virtually no worms. All the worms had died off, and the few surviving worms, I wanted to let them live, so I took the system out into the garden, emptied the contents of the bin, hosed it down so that the really clumpy, muddy material that the bin was full of would loosen up enough to let the surviving worms, wriggle their way out of the material and hopefully work their way down into the garden dirt and live and survive. And then, if you're a regular here on my channel, you'll know that this happened 2 other times recently. Once 7 days ago, and most recently 3 days ago. And here it's labeled similarly, showing that the bin was emptied into the garden, which it hasn't really even happened yet. I just took those bins outside, so those tubs with the remaining compost are outside in the garden, and the worms that I was able to retrieve out of those systems were released into this system right here, which is undergoing migration. It's not even a pure red wiggler system. It's a system that has red wigglers in it, but also European night crawlers and blue worms. So on 3 separate occasions here, I've had one system where the video's thumbnail looked like this, indicating "Rest in peace, poor worms." That's the one where I released the worms out into the garden, and then later came the first attempt at rescuing surviving worms out of the first system. And then here was the thumbnail for the more recent one 3 days ago when I was rescuing yet even more worms. And believe it or not, we're now down into the last bin that was pure red wigglers, which was up until not too long ago a population that I estimated to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2,000 worms. And when we checked in there 3 days ago, things did not look too good, but I hoped that things might be able to recover. I put in a bunch of bedding. I even fed the system, but it's not looking good. So I believe now I'm once again going to attempt the rescue of some worms out of that system. And at that point, that'll be the end of my red wiggler populations. I mean, here I've got red wigglers in this box, but it's not pure red wigglers. And I know I've got red wigglers in my outdoor systems too, but I went from having what I had estimated down here. You could see I've tried to total these estimated launching population numbers into a total. 7,200 is what I estimated those bins had originally launched with, but the populations in those systems were probably breeding, probably multiplying. So if I had to guess, I've probably lost about 8,000 red wigglers over the past month. And I'm about to go back into that last bin now and try to pluck out the remaining surviving worms and rescue them as well. And then I'll have 3 bins of depopulated castings, which are, I don't know, the material is suspect, because if the worms can't live in it, I don't know what good it is. But I didn't want to just empty it into the garden not knowing what to expect from that material. I was also thinking that material's probably got a whole bunch of cocoons in it too, so I'm still trying to figure out some way of maybe stacking up that material someplace where it might be able to get rinsed off by the rains, and then maybe just by nature getting a foothold in that material, helping it revive a little bit, and maybe the cocoons within that material will survive and thrive. So I've still got to figure out what to do with all these material that has not yet been emptied. Just got 2 bins, and now there's going to be a 3rd bin I'm going to take outside into the garden, and I've got to come up with a game plan. But first comes first is just trying to get the remaining surviving worms out of that last bin and moved out of there before I end up losing them too. And there too, I don't expect to find more than just a handful of worms in that case. So I'm going to go tend to that now. I'm not going to shoot video of it. It's just, me hunched over that bin, picking worms out one at a time. Perhaps I'll bring the camera down there later once I've managed to rescue a certain number of worms out of there, and maybe we'll just film their release into this last bin that's a mix of red wigglers and other worms. But I don't know where this is going to lead in terms of red wigglers in my wormery. I'd love to have red wigglers in my wormery, but I don't even know. Maybe I've got to turn to my outdoor systems to try populating some new indoor red wiggler bins. But I'm going to head down there now. We'll see what I can come up with, and maybe I'll turn the camera on a little while when I finish. So I'm down here in my wormery, and I'm already at work on the bin. I've been at work at this for about 3/4 of an hour or so. And like I did last time, I had shoved the entire contents of the bin over to one side. And while working my way through it, I've just been piling up the stuff that I've sifted through on this side. And what you see piled up over here are just the larger chunks of uncomposted bedding and food stuff that I had found. So you could see a lot of the little leafy material that had been blended in here in the hopes that maybe boosting the carbon, the bedding in here 3 days ago might help. And what remains is this little pile here. That's why I just thought I would run upstairs and grab the camera and just start rolling for the last few minutes of this. You can see that the number of worms that I've managed to collect are very minimal, very small number of worms that I was able to rescue out of here. And if this little remaining pile is anything like last time I did this, it does almost seem like I was possibly corralling the worms into this corner, so we might actually find a little bit more of a worm population in this last little chunk when we get in here. But there's probably not many more worms that we're going to be able to rescue. I did find a few worms that look sort of like this one here. Just not even mobile anymore. Must have just recently met its end. I found a few other worms like that. It was only towards the end, though, I found worms like that. In the beginning, most of the worms I was bumping into seemed pretty mobile, and, you know, just from their color, they look okay for the most part. So it's still kind of a mystery as to what the heck is happening over here. But I was just picking through this stuff like this, kind of crumbling it apart a little bit, looking for scraps of food to pull out, looking for worms to rescue. And in the process, whenever I would stumble on a cocoon, I would try to pull that out as well. Not many cocoons to be found. I mean, that's not true. I'm sure there's plenty to be found. But I would just have to sort of slow down and look for them. But whenever I did spot a cocoon, I would, you know, pluck it out and drop it in here. But there's got to be hundreds, thousands of cocoons in here, who knows how many, which could possibly result in some baby worms hatching out. And that's the reason I didn't dump out the other 2 containers that I've already done this to, that are just sitting outside at this point. I took the bins outside, not knowing exactly what to think about the contents. So yeah, see down here's a couple more worms. Quite a number of worms, actually, compared to what I've, you know, encountered through the entire contents of the bin. So this is pretty much all I was doing here, is just pulling out the worms that I could find. The ones that appeared to still be moving, any ones that looked like they were just chunks of worms or obviously dead worms, if they were not moving, they were just sort of included in this pile over here. Like this poor little guy over here. And it's unfortunate because, like I said earlier, like I showed you on the spreadsheet earlier too, the system had probably enough worms in it to fill this container halfway full. So there would have been, you know, a huge number of worms in here up until just recently, you know. It was just recently I started seeing evidence of some sort of a problem going from bin to bin, working its way, I don't know, from bin to bin, or maybe it's some sort of a problem that made its way into all of my bins at once. And it just sort of manifested itself in various intensities over time, depending on the bin, or whatever the variables were that caused it to just go haywire and cause the decline of each of these systems. The one thing that I did notice in the other bins that didn't seem as evident here was it did seem like in the other systems where there was these huge die-offs, that there was a huge number of mites that went hand in hand with that. And my assumption was that the mites were there just sort of doing cleanup, and their numbers were multiplying in huge numbers because of the abundance of dead worms that was maybe their food source. But in this bin, I don't really see the sort of mite population that I've seen in some of the other bins where I was experiencing the huge die out of worms. So I'm going to just pick back and forth through this pile a little bit more, looking for anything that might still be squirming or might still be alive. And I believe we've more or less rescued all the worms that are still alive in this system, or at least the better portion of them. And this bin, I guess we'll just go outside too for a while until I can figure out what to do. At this point, I've got 3 bins, if you count this one. 3 bins worth of material sitting out there. And just sitting out there with the assumption that it's probably got a bunch of cocoons in it. Then it would be nice if I could somehow come up with a game plan that would allow for the retrieval of the worms once all those cocoons begin hatching. I don't know if maybe leaving the material outside, let it air out, let the rain fall into it. I don't know. I'm really not sure what to make of the situation. So I'm more or less done picking through this at this point. I don't know, I'm going to turn the camera off. I might actually pick through this one more time, just kind of shove the material all back over in the opposite direction. Give myself one last chance at maybe saving a couple more worms, but I'm not going to take much more time with this. I'll turn the camera on in a few minutes when I'm ready to move this bin aside and move the other bin out of here that we're going to release these rescued worms into. Well, as you can see, I'm almost done doing this backwards pass through the material, and I did find one little itsy bitsy worm and one adult-sized worm, but that was it. So I must have been pretty thorough on the initial sweep through the material. I did spot a number of cocoons along the way too, which I extracted, but I was mainly looking for signs of worms squirming. Wasn't really going too out of my way to look for cocoons, but sometimes there's just a cocoon sitting right there in front of you. But like I said, I've kind of trained my eye to look for signs of worms, not so much cocoons. But like I said, the cocoons that I did find along the way that were easy enough to just pull right out, I did place in here alongside the worms. And I did find a couple other chunks of uneaten bedding and food and stuff in here besides worms and cocoons that I piled up off to the side as well. But I'm more or less done here. So I don't think there's any more worms to be found in here. I'm sure there still are worms that I missed. And even though all of their neighbors, or at least most of their neighbors, with the exception of the ones that survived and got rescued here, met their demise, I can only hope that they continue to survive. And I'm going to place this container outside, just like I did the other ones. And I've got to come up with a plan for what to do with these. Like I said, I'm hoping that maybe I can come up with a way of maybe rinsing the material off, letting it dry out a little bit, hopefully giving it time for some cocoons to hatch. Maybe I can, recoup some of my red wiggler population by doing that. But I want it to make sense, and I don't want it to become a big pain in the neck either. So the whole idea of what I'm going to do with this is just sort of a straw man right now, and exactly how I implement that is still to be determined. Love to hear some ideas from anybody who might have any. I mean, I could always stack this stuff up out on the ground, and then maybe worms will be able to hatch out and survive within it, and maybe they'll stay in the pile, and maybe I'd be able to retrieve them. I really don't know. I don't know if the material is just so toxic or whatever the case may be, that any worms that do emerge from their cocoons might just be doomed from the start by being born into this stuff. But I I guess this officially ends this 71-day system with a fairly modest, small number of worms rescued out of it. So we'll release those worms into my other system that's got red wigglers in it. It's that that hybrid system with the Euros in there and the blue worms. So let me once again take a short break to haul this material outside, and we'll regroup as soon as I've got a chance to release these guys into their new home. So before releasing the worms, I'm going to give them a little rinse. It's something people have suggested in the past, but it was always after the fact, so hopefully it's not too little, too late. But I'm going to give these worms a rinse and then drain the water off in this paper towel, and then we're going to introduce them to this container here. So I'm going to run over to the sink and take care of that, and I'll be right back. So like I said, hopefully it's not too little, too late. But we've given the worms a little bit of a rinse off. Maybe leaving behind some of the whatever it is that was giving them grief, and hopefully minimizing what I carry over with them into the new environment. And this is not a pure red wiggler environment like I mentioned earlier. There are some red wigglers in here, but they're living in here with a number of other types of worms. But it's pretty much the only captive red wiggler audience that I've got anymore. Audience? Population? Whatever the right word is. You can see last time I was in here, I had sprayed down a whole bunch of neem cake. You can see a worm hanging out over here. This is the edge of the bin where I've been attempting to feed and put fresh bedding. This is the side of the bin where I've been trying to let it dry out a little bit, in the hopes that it becomes a little bit less appealing for other worms to want to remain in, and that they're going to make their way over here. It's been, I believe, 29 days. I'm trying to remember what the spreadsheet said. That this migration of the worms has been underway. So at some point soon, I'm probably going to be ready to begin relocating worms out of this space here. I guess let's take a quick peek here. You can see also that there's a bunch of flying insects that seem to have made themselves at home in here too, which isn't really the ideal situation. But I would have to assume that over here, yeah, we've got all of our, not all of our worms, but I would assume a good number of the worms that were inhabiting this bin have at this point made their way over here. I've reinforced the food supply in this feeding area a couple times. There's all kinds of fresh leaves in here for them to come over to. As you can see, there's some large worms. Here's the European... Oop, apologies. Amber alert. But yeah, like I said, you can see there's large worms in here. That must be the European nightcrawler. The really fast-moving skinny worms, those would be the Indian blues. And originally when I traded with somebody to get these worms, I traded some of my red wigglers for this population of worms. I was told that the worms came originally from Uncle Jim's worm farm, and that they were supposedly red wigglers originally, but I believe most people understand that already, that if you're buying red wigglers from Uncle Jim's worm farm, chances are you're going to get a good number of Indian blues in there mixed in. And usually those are the worms that you see that are real fast movers. You know, you get a handful of worms, and as soon as you see the ones that are just really cruising really fast, those are the ones that you have to assume are the Indian blue worms. So I'm glad to see that in this bin at least, the migration's working. The worms seem to be thriving in their new space. It was only 3 days ago that I came in here to add some more food, add some more bedding. And each time I do that, I've been pushing the material in here over. So I'm just curious to see if the material out here is indeed drying. It is drying nicely by being covered with only a sheet of paper. And hopefully at some point soon the material will become dry enough that most worms will get moving, looking for a more comfortable space to be, and they'll make their way over here too. So you know, every chance I get, I'll usually come over here and I'll try to till the material up. Since it's been 3 days since I did it last time, I suppose there's no harm in submerging some of the more dry stuff down and bringing the more damp stuff up to allow that to air out as well. But the stuff is definitely becoming nice and crumbly now. It was a little bit muddy and thick, but as it dries, it becomes a lot more crumbly and manageable and dry. And by being dry, it becomes less of a cozy spot for the worms to want to remain in. So it does seem like this far end of the bin is becoming less and less populated. We fished a couple worms out and helped them over to where we want them, but we certainly didn't see many. So the migration of the worms out of this material could be drawing to an end pretty soon at some point, but it will continue. And I guess let's get these little guys situated in their new home. I guess we can even leave this paper towel with them. It can just act as a cover for the feeding area. So let's see if we can spread these little guys out a bit and get a sense of how many we collected. Like I said, it's not many. Not many at all. I probably could have just gone in here and counted them one by one. Probably would have ended up amounting to about 50 or 60 worms or so. It's hard to tell. Definitely hard to tell, but not many, which is really unfortunate considering they came out of a bin that had been originally populated with a very large number of worms. So my only hope is that they're now in a space that's going to be a lot more comfortable and hospitable for them. Let's get these cocoons over here too. And that's that. So, like I said, I'll recycle this paper into this feeding area. It's always a good thing to just have varied types of bedding where you want your worms to be, because they like that. And then the other stuff that was over here covering things up was, I guess, what was this? It was another sheet of newspaper over here, becoming fairly tattered at this point. And I guess that'll also sort of help keep the moisture down within the feeding area. This paper, on the other hand, is really not intended to keep moisture within the material. I do want to let the material continue drying. I'm almost wondering if I should leave it uncovered, because it does seem like the flying insects are really digging that paper and hanging out beneath it. I'm almost wondering if I'd be better off without it. In fact, the flying insects even seem like they're making their way into this plastic bag too. A little bit of a nuisance to see so many of them. So I'll have to come up with a better game plan for dealing with them at some point in the near future too. But I think at this point they're more of a nuisance than anything else. I don't think that they're harming the worms or causing any sort of major damage. At least I hope so. I hope that's the case. So that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. It's always hard to imagine that someone's enjoying a video that depicts the, decimation of an entire worm population. So like I said last time, even if you just found it informative, or maybe if you just kind of feel for my situation, then give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And hopefully we'll see you back here next time. Also consider subscribing to the channel too if you haven't done so already. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.